Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. It's Friday, January 29th, episode 43. Great show today, our COVID news. Then our friend Ryan Erickson from Packaging Compliance Labs is going to be talking to us about medical device packaging, a really important part of the product development process. And then time for Q&A and check-ins. This is our last show before we start that pitch party next week, so we're looking forward to that. And as we transition to the COVID news, you may notice that the background behind me has changed. Our family is going through a COVID lockdown, and we're just waiting on some test results. But I guess I won't be making it to the vaccine personally because it's very likely that I'm enjoying the virus right now myself. So with that, this takes on a whole new personal meaning as we review the COVID metrics from covidtracking.com, which, as you recall, has been a really stalwart data site from our friends at The Atlantic. The journalists at The Atlantic got together because they wanted to be able to track the numbers from a single source. And what we see here is that this is actually finally coming down. The hospitalizations in the US really having shown a peak a few weeks back and coming down. You recall that we mentioned 924,000 staffed hospital beds in the US. We're about to drop back below 100,000 of those being occupied by COVID patients. Peaks all over the US in the regions, the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, the West, and all of those seem to be coming over the top, which is great news. Obviously, higher peaks in almost all cases, except for the Northeast, than happened this spring. And here are the numbers per million residents around the country. Obviously, harder hit in the South, but the North not exempt either. And this graph looks about the same as it did last week. Cases are rising in 2 states, a little bit less falling in 41 states and staying the same in 13 states as of today from covidtracking.com, but obviously good news. And then Michigan, we are definitely seeing the drop here, present company accepted, that we are seeing the numbers come down across the board. And so it looks like we are going to be reaching summer numbers, we hope, in the coming weeks, which would be a very exciting development after a really hard winter. I want to remind you of this site, bengregorydata.com. Such a cool visualization if you want to see how the disease in hospitalizations has made its way around the country. And you can watch that go hospitalizations per 10,000 patients. And you can watch the different regions light up and then the whole country light up here this last winter. And that's been the story. A peak in the Northeast, and then a peak in the South and the West, and then a nationwide peak more recently. In terms of vaccine distributions, we've been tracking this for the last few weeks, ever since the end of the year. And it looks now like Michigan is up to 9% of adults, that is over the age of 16, having received a vaccination. That's a total of 850,000 vaccine doses administered. So those numbers continue to climb. Maybe surprising, maybe not surprising. We're just reporting it as fact that 57% of Michigan nursing home staff residents declined COVID vaccine so far. This again from MLive, who has been doing a great job of tracking this. And quite a few people, more than half in nursing homes, staff and residents declining the vaccine. So take that for what it's worth. Sort of an interesting number to be working with there. Here is per 10,000 residents. Purple would be a good dark number, and the lighter colors, the oranges and the yellows, not quite as much of the population being vaccinated, but you can see the Upper Peninsula has really rolled it out. It's making its way down through the state. Any number of reasons why this might be the case, but as we see nationwide, this is largely a population density question. So we expect those numbers to continue to rise in the southern part of the state. Here's that site, the New York Times, that we've been tracking for a few weeks. This graph is going to look almost identical to how it looked last week, with one exception. These little tiny numbers up here on that on the legend have jumped from 3.5 to 5.5% to 5.5 to 7.5. So what that basically means is this whole graph went up by 2%. That's 2% of the population or that much further along. The less populous areas do seem to do a better job of getting more complete rollout more quickly. That will be something that I'm sure gets discussed as this goes along, but that's where it is nationwide. I want to remind you, the pitch party starts next week. We're looking forward to that. We've got February already filled up. If you haven't heard from us on your date, hold tight. We're going to get to you and let you know exactly when you're coming on the show, but we're looking forward to starting that next week. And one more time, if you know startups who would like to pitch for a chance at $1,000 each month, send them to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org to be eligible for selection. Any U.S. MedTech startup is eligible for consideration, and we would love to have folks join us. Send us that pitch deck. So with that, I'm going to stop the share, and I want to welcome our first guest, who is Ryan Erickson of Packaging Compliance Labs, to our show. Ryan, are you with us?
Hey, Gene, I'm with you. Just getting my stuff turned on here. Hey, can you see me?
We can see you just fine. Welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So Ryan, we always like to talk when the time is right. We always like to talk about the MedTech development process, medical devices, how we get there. As you know, we talk to investors and we talk to startups and we talk to inventors. And one of the biggest values I think we've all been able to talk about together is when we can get deep into something that most people don't know about because they just haven't been exposed to it. And there are those of us who live our careers deep in aspects of medical device development that most of the world is just completely oblivious to. And I'm really excited what you and I are going to be talking about today. And I know it's not device packaging, but I just saw in the news the other day that there's this big stink on the drug side over the Pfizer vaccine and whether you can get 5 doses out of the package or 6 doses out of the package. And I thought, oh man, because Ryan's going to be talking to us today about usability of medical device packaging. And I just thought, wow, that's a classic usability example of we don't even know how many doses we can get out of the package because no one actually studied that before the rollout. And now they're having that trouble. But before we go into the details, and you've got a cool presentation for us, I wanted to ask you, you're a co-founder of PCL. You've been doing this. This is your career. You live, breathe, eat, sleep packaging for medical devices. What is your passion, Ryan? Why would somebody make a career out of this? What keeps you going and makes you want to do this?
Sure. I think that's really a great way to start. I am very passionate about it. Sometimes when I'm talking about it, I can get a little emotional. So if I choke up, just feel free to jump in and save me here. Because I have somebody very close to me that has a chronic and debilitating medical condition. And, we have really struggled to find a proper diagnosis, as well as find, a treatment that is effective. And sometimes, when we're feeling like where do we go from here? I always maintain this hope that one of these days we're going to be involved in a project that there's a product or a device or a technology that, that is going to be the right technology to make the difference. And I get really excited that and thankful that we can maybe one day have that project in our custody so that we can put it through the very well-oiled mechanisms and gears that we've established here so that it gets to market as quickly and safely as possible. And in the meantime, I think all of us, really just appreciate the fact that at any given time, somebody else's miracle might be coming through the lab that we're supporting. And that really, I think, gets us all passionate to come in every day and try to use our energy in a way that makes an impact. Yeah, that's a little bit about what gets me excited, and everybody has their own personal story, of course, but I think we all share the same underlying vision and motivation, and that's really exciting.
That's awesome. And it's always wonderful when you can link that back down and understand that some of these basics, they got to keep happening. And then you're looking for those times when Yeah, this impacts something that I can really relate to.
Absolutely.
I wish you and those close to you the best, and I'm really thankful that you're doing this. I think you could bring up your presentation, Ryan. We'd like to go through a few different things here, and for the audience, as Ryan and I were talking about this, I want you to know what PCL does, and then we also want to talk about some of these issues about what are the standards behind this. Why packaging? Who cares about medical device packaging? It's usually an afterthought for a lot of people, and most people don't realize what a huge amount of development can go into that. And it relates to things like usability and product function, and it relates to the sterility of the parts. And Ryan's going to get into all of those things, which we're very passionate about here at Into Being. And it's nice to have somebody like Ryan to be able to talk about this from just the packaging standpoint. So I guess with that, Ryan, why don't you take it away? We may bring some questions in from the audience during the presentation. We may save them for after. Just depends on what comes up. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or type it into the chat box as we go forward.
Yeah, and I would just like to echo that. It would be a lot more enjoyable for me the more conversational we can make it. So please feel free to interject at any time. I've structured our talk today into 3 parts. The first being an introduction to PCL, and then we'll get into ISO 11607, which is the governing standard that our industry is really organized around. And then we'll dive in a little bit to human factors and talk about how that plays a role in the work we do and why it's relevant today. Is there anything else, Gene, that you think would be important we talk through?
No, I think it'll be great if we go through that, and then we'll see where we find ourselves, and we'll talk about it.
Great. So when people think about packaging, it's common for people to think about just a bag in a box, basically. And what people don't realize is that there is really the core of what's important about medical packaging is what we call the sterile barrier system. And this is the layer of packaging that makes direct contact with the device that is intended to provide the hermetic barrier so that microorganisms do not ingress into the package and cause a contamination of the device. So naturally, that's anything about medical packaging is also going to involve bags and boxes and other protective packaging. But really, I think it's an important distinction to make as we approach this today is really the core essence of the work is really around the sterile barrier system and making sure that that's intact and that patients therefore have a safer experience without the risk of an infection that could be presented by contamination on its way to the use environment. So what is PCL, Packaging Compliance Labs? We are a packaging design, development, and validation organization. We're based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. There's 2 main sections of our business. We have our packaging validation lab, which is ISO 17025 accredited. We also have a team of packaging engineers that work with customers on particular phases of given projects to really help move things forward the right way, to set up the right strategy, and help them solve very specific problems along the way. And we do that work with a mission of delivering solutions that enable life-changing medical innovation. You can tell sort of a reflection in the mission from the story that I told a few minutes ago, but again, everybody has their own stories. And this is the way that collectively we feel we can make the biggest impact. So our mission is to make a difference, and to do that using the capabilities and expertise that we have available to us, which is the subject of medical packaging. I'm going to go through just a few slides here on some of the things that we do at PCL, but I'm going to then further kind of break these concepts down when we get into the next section. So don't mind me just blowing through some of this stuff because we'll dig into it. But one of the core things that we do at the lab on a daily basis is transit testing, and this is where we simulate the shipping and handling environment that a packaged product might encounter, which includes climate conditioning, as well as dynamic hazards like drop and vibration, compression, impact. And of course, we want to make sure that packaging systems maintain a sterile barrier after they've gone through shipping and handling.
And Ryan, I just that picture there that you've got brings back a memory, and I just got to go back because I think what we're looking at there is a shaker table on the last slide.
Yeah,
is that correct?
Mention that. Yeah, this is an image of one of our 2 vibration tables. We'll be buying a 3rd this year sometime. But yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Gene.
No, I remember for a project that I was an engineer on many years ago, and I had to take it to a lab much like yours and subject this package that we had carefully and lovingly put together. And they stuck it on one of these shaker tables and just absolutely beat the snot out of the thing, before dropping it in all the ways that they could figure out. So this is a very dynamic thing happening right here.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun to watch. We always have an open door policy. We love visitors. I know the time of COVID makes that uniquely challenging, but by and large, we really love to have people out to the lab. We take a lot of pride in the space, and it's a lot of fun just watching the stuff work and to show it off. So if anybody's local in the area would like to come in anytime, feel free to get in touch. We'd be happy to have you out. Another major segment of our lab is around accelerated aging. And this is where we essentially put product packaging samples into a large oven. So these images on the left that are sort of behind the text are large walk-in chambers that we turn to pretty high temperatures, put product in there for weeks, months on end, and the intent is to rapidly simulate the effects of aging so we can subsequently verify sterile barrier integrity and other characteristics to qualify shelf life claims. We've mentioned sterile barrier integrity testing a lot. We can zoom in on this a little bit more. It involves a handful of activities. Things related to checking the seals to see if there's any channels, folds, voids, prematurely opened seals, etc. To looking at the body of the package, well, visually, yes, but also subjecting it to very specific tests that are intended to evaluate the body of a package and make sure there's no holes or tears. We also have different ways that we can measure the strength of seals, and other types of characteristics, which we may go into more a little bit later. One of the things that I just wanted to highlight as it's relevant to the current COVID situation, our lab wasn't involved in any of the vaccine stuff that's going on, but the type of work, if you heard about it in the news, the need for keeping the vaccine cold, and you might have heard the term cold chain come up a couple of times. We support that type of work. What that means is if there's a pharmaceutical product or a biologic, something that is supposed to remain cold until it's opened and used, we have some services that we provide in order to demonstrate the effectiveness of those type of shipping containers. And then our engineering team, what I'm highlighting here, we call them micro programs, can get involved and plugged into projects in a variety of capacities. A lot of times our customers will come to us with a very specific problem, so we'll deploy an engineer to help solve that. Or in an aggregate sense, we can participate in projects from A to Z and encounter a lot of these types of things along the way, some of which we'll get into more as we discuss the nature of the work in ISO 11607. And then, as we talked about earlier, we're going to feature part of the talk on usability, so I'll save that for the end, but that would be something that our lab is supporting as it relates to packaging as well. So that's the conclusion of the first section, and let me know what questions you have.
No, that's great. It sounds like you guys really do a wide variety of things, and I think when you and I were talking before, it's important to recognize that there's other folks in the state who build packaging and things like that, and you guys might end up specifying their packaging. You might be the ones to beat it up and check that it's going to work for a particular use, but I just can't overemphasize how important this is that these things get considered. I think we can go into the introduction to ISO 11607 because, as our audience will be familiar, there's certain standards that govern large swaths of the medical device development process, maybe for electrical safety, or for risk analysis and other things like that. And this is the one that has to do with sterile barrier systems. You can say it better than I can, but we'd love the introduction.
Sounds great. So maybe just starting at the biggest level and root this in the FDA requirements. Packaging safety and effectiveness is part of the requirement of 21 CFR 820, which encompasses many of the regulations that affect the nature of the work that we do. However, that information in the FDA regs at that level is fairly vague and not super prescriptive. And so what has happened over the last few decades is that an international standard, ISO 11607, was developed. It first came out, and forgive me for anybody out there who's a veteran and might want to correct me. I think the first issue of 11607 came out in the 90s. I might be mistaken. When I entered the professional world in the late 2000s, we were working on the version from 2006, and just a couple of years ago in 2019 was the latest update to the standard. It had been over 10 years, and that is the update which introduced usability that we'll come to later. So this has been a work in process. It's an international standard. It is harmonized with the European version of this, which has different roots, but it's called EN 868. And it's generally well recognized in most regulated healthcare markets, although we do have to be cognizant of unique market-to-market differences when we're working with products that are going to be distributed outside of the United States. And there's two parts to ISO 11607. Part one really focuses on everything we might capture under the bucket of design. So materials, design considerations, form, fit, function, design and performance validation. And then part two is applicable to the production environments, production processes, and validation of those processes. I encourage anybody to, go out there and try to read ISO 11607. It's an interesting read, but it is a little bit intimidating. And so one of the ways that we try to just make it a little bit more coherent and relatable, at least from the perspective of our organization and where we fit in the big picture, as far as most of our work having some sort of laboratory event around it. We kind of pulled from ISO 11607 what we call the 3 pillars of packaging validation. And this is sort of the storyline that helps us develop the strategies around, what approach we want to take based on some of the unique circumstances on a project-to-project basis. In a nutshell, though, what I'd want to highlight is that typically the first major category of work is the work related to the production processes, because we can't really go out and validate a packaging system if we don't have good parts to start with. So the ability to consistently and reliably make good packaged parts is really what is part 2 of ISO 11607. We call it our first pillar. We'll go into that in more detail. And then we assume that once good packages are coming off the factory line, the next step in the equation is we want to make sure that those can go through the hazards of shipping, handling, storage, sterilization, et cetera, and arrive to the clinical use environments in a way that is still safe. There hasn't been a rip or tear, a reason for the parts to become contaminated or broken, things like that. Once it arrives safely, then we're going to assume that it will sit in a hospital supply room or on a shelf, maybe for weeks, maybe for months, maybe for years, as indicated by the expiration date claim on the package. And so, of course, there needs to be some work that goes into proving out the expiration date claims. Before I go on, this would be a good intermittent point for me just to pause and see if all that made sense and if you have any questions.
Yeah, and if there's any questions from the audience, feel free to raise your hand. I think this is a great highlight here. Actually, we do have a question here from Ken Spencer. Let's let Ken go first. Ken, you're live.
Okay, thanks. Wow, this is really interesting, Ryan. So a question on the stringent certification. Is there any difference between what the FDA wants for like an EUA versus a 510K or other certification?
Is the I'm not a regulatory consultant, so forgive me if I'm not latching into the question here. When you say the EUA, are you referring to the temporary exemptions that are going on?
That's correct. Yeah, the emergency use authorizations.
The emergency use. Yeah, thank you very much. So we're still trying to wrap our heads around how we fit into that. We've done some investigating and research on our end to understand what role and the way that might impact our work and how we relate to our customers. What I've sort of taken away from that is that basically all of the EUAs are very product specific. So EUAs for a wound care system are going to be different than EUAs for a hip replacement system, are going to be different than this, that, and the other. And they all sort of have their own requirements and expectations. So the baseline that we're operating from is that the foundational requirements here need to be met either way. And if a customer has a particular application in which they've otherwise secured an EUA, then that is something we can easily work with them on. But it is a little bit of, there's a lot going on and a lot to sift through. And we're still sort of learning as we go as well, I think, as we all are.
Cool, thanks.
I can add just a little bit to that from the regulatory perspective. What we've seen, Ken and Ryan, is that when FDA normally has a requirement, for example, for biocompatibility or something like that, they're not necessarily going to drop that requirement for the EUA. They may reduce the reporting requirements. They may reduce the scrutiny. So what I would surmise, and I can't tell you which EUAs have this, is if they care about sterility, they're still going to care about sterility. And this is going to be how you're going to demonstrate it. So you're probably still going to go through this process. Whether they've changed any of the reporting requirements would be on an EUA by EUA basis.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, the handful of EUAs I've looked at specifically, I've seen statements and clauses in there similar to what you just said, Gene, that while there might be some sense of relaxing the reporting requirements or the minimum amount of due diligence to authorize something to be sold, that it doesn't otherwise waive the normal requirements. They maybe become things that just work in the background as the product is being sold and distributed. And you better make sure that you have a good rationale and justification, because if there's an issue with that work downstream, I'm sure that could be very problematic. So yeah, that's still the baseline that we're operating on and trying to help navigate that on kind of a case-by-case basis right now.
Yeah, great question, Ken. Thank you for that. And Ryan, I think this is a great, I love this slide. I'd like people to really let this one burn into their memory, because in the experience that we have with working with folks like yourself doing packaging compliance, you really do have these three phases, right? You've got to get this thing made and bundled up together, and you've got to not bust it while you're doing that. And you've got to get it to where it's going to go. And then it's got to last. It's got to stay on that shelf and maintain its sterility and maintain its performance. And the product performance has to be existing all the way through this.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll kind of dive in. The next few slides, what we're going to do is just zoom up on each of these pillars. I think I've got 2 slides on each pillar, but I know we're already spending a lot of time, and I've got some more content I want to share. So I might run through it fairly quickly, but I'll pause at the end of the section, which will be another good opportunity if there's anything that you guys want me just to spend a little bit more time on. So for this first pillar, how do we what is involved with this first pillar, as we call it? The goal is really to demonstrate that the packaging process can consistently and reliably meet all of the critical to quality specifications. And the course of that work really has 3 steps that go in sequence. The first is the equipment installation qualification, then the operational qualification, and then finally the process qualification. Next couple of slides will go into those more. And at each step of the way, what we're really interested in trying to characterize and prove out is that things related to the finished dimensions of the packages, the thickness of any film, or the features of any geometries that are created during the packaging process come out appropriate, that we have intact seals that have a specified seal strength and a width of that seal that is specified, that an end user can open a cereal package and dispense a product aseptically without contaminating that product by virtue of opening it. And that other things related to the product package interaction otherwise don't become issues, like does the product fit? Will something slip off and become caught in the seal? That type of thing. So in IQ, we're really focused on the equipment and machinery. I've got just a few images of some of the types of sealing machines we work with, probably familiar to most people. And the IQ is just a fairly, it's an important step, but a fairly straightforward step where, we're making sure the equipment operates as it's intended to. We're checking safety features, its ability to alarm when something has exceeded a limit. That if we push a button, that does what it's supposed to do when that button's pushed. That calibration is performed. We have the right documentation, so on and so forth. So the IQ is an important step, but usually a pretty quick one. And then we go into more of an engineering effort where what we're attempting to do is define what the operating window is for the materials that are going to be sealed on the machine. So there's always 3 parameters. Sometimes there's more, but there's always at least 3 that are very important, and that is time, temperature, and pressure. Those are the ingredients to making a good seal. And so during the step of the OQ, what we're doing is observing the typical process fluctuation of those parameters over longer runs. We're trying to understand where we should set alarm limits so that we're not getting cycle stops on the line constantly. We're looking at calibration tolerances, and we're stacking all those things up. And then pushing process window limits just outside that we're going to qualify. And hopefully all of that lands within the edge of failure, which might be not having enough energy to create a good seal, or having so much energy that we're burning the seals or creating other weird conditions. So in the OK, we're making samples at this low and high limit, and then doing various package integrity tests, making sure that everything bears out, which gives us confidence that we've identified the right parameters range and that all of that works. The next step in the process is called the PQ. And this is where we say, great, we've got an operating window, and we know in production they're going to be using this operating window. I usually specify that they have to set the parameters right in the middle. Not everybody does that. But either way, whatever your expectation is for how you're going to operate the process in production, this is the part of the effort where we try to simulate that. So we're using product or representative products. At minimum, we're building 3 lots. We're trying to use multiple trained personnel, and we're considering things like breaks, shift changes, startups, and shutdowns. And as we build those samples out, we're doing the same type of package integrity tests, making sure that we have consistency and continuity across those multiple lots to build confidence in the future production, the quality of future pieces produced in production. This is just the fickle part of my personality. I just wanted to add a note here. Usually this work is done in a clean room environment. Obviously these photos, people are not dressed and not all gowned up. These just happen to be photos I have of a PQ that I thought were fun. In this case, we actually had a couple of phases to the project. We did an initial pre-qualification at our lab, which is where this work was taking place. And then there was a second phase where the machine was reintroduced, and there were some reasons for that. But these are our customer sent a team out, and it was awesome because we got to train them and also play with how the line might be configured. So we moved things around and had a little bit of fun with it. And by the time it was reintroduced, so much groundwork had already been laid for a much more seamless introduction. So that covers the first pillar. We've got good parts coming off the line, and now we're getting into the next pillar, which the goal is to demonstrate that will these packages we're making that are good, if we were to now ship them, can they get to the end user safely? And some of the things that we're looking at is properly defining worst case. So obviously we might have a portfolio of products, and we're not going to do testing on every single one of them. So there's usually a lot of due diligence. That could be its own discussion around identifying worst case. And then once we have that identified, we're building out the samples, sending them out for sterilization. And then when they come back to the lab, we're exposing them to extreme climate conditions, and then doing the laboratory shipping and handling studies. After which, of course, we're checking for sterile barrier integrity. And a few pictures here show the types of things that we sometimes encounter. It could be a puncture. It could be abrasion, it could be a pinhole, slice, tear, any number of different things, and we want to make sure we don't see any of that. A couple of just comments on climate conditioning. Usually this is part of the front end of a laboratory distribution project, and we expose the product packaging systems to a range of extremes like frozen, tropical, desert, so that we can represent the worst case that might be encountered throughout the world. Some of our customers have very specific supply chains and have well characterized what they're going to expect and encounter. Of course, any study that comes through the lab can be modified accordingly. This is just sort of the baseline. And once we have packages that have been exposed to climate extremes, that's when we then introduce them to the different dynamic hazards like drop testing, random vibration, concentrated impact, compression, and an assortment of other things that really aim to simulate the stuff that you see on the screen here. Things getting really beaten up and broken in transit. So we try to make a worst case study that is going to really be extreme in representing those different types of things. Once we are satisfied that products can arrive to the hospital safely, then we get into the satisfying the third pillar, which is around shelf life. And here the goal is to make sure that we can maintain a sterile barrier through all the duration of the claimed expiry date. And there's two ways that this is approached. The requirement and what sometimes, Jane, you asked me before the call if there was anything that I would really want from an educational standpoint to convey to the audience. This would be one thing that sticks out. We find ourselves having to have this discussion a lot, that real-time aging is always a requirement. But instead of actually waiting 5 years, let's say, to get the product on that, FDA and ISO and the standards give us an alternative path that runs in parallel, which is accelerated aging. And that's where I'll just go into it. Accelerated aging, we put product package samples in the oven and let them bake to more rapidly simulate the effects of aging. It is a theoretical study design, which is why real-time results always need to substantiate the accelerated results when they become available. But just to help you understand how does the time frame compress when we're talking about accelerated aging, the most common temperature that we tend to deploy is 55 degrees Celsius. And at 55 degrees Celsius, when samples are in the oven for 40 days, the theoretical expectation is that when we remove those at 40 days, that the condition that those packages are in, the strength of the seals that we measure, any behaviors or characteristics that we're interested in studying, that those would be otherwise representative of a similar packaged product that might otherwise be sitting on a warehouse shelf in ambient conditions for literally 1 year. And so that's sort of the compression rate that we're talking about. It takes about 6 months to do a 5-year study at 55 Celsius. And then we can crank up the temperature to try to further compress those time frames. But then we start getting into an interesting discussion that we could probably spend more time on later about where's the right place to draw the line. But that's sort of typical. And then real-time aging, there's not a whole lot more to add except that it's literally samples sitting on the shelf in the warehouse. One thing that's important is monitoring temperature and humidity in case there's any issues that you may want to investigate. We see that sometimes not happening when our customers are storing real-time samples themselves. And also having samples in a good, safe storage place and they're not going to get lost. It's just a reality of the industry today. A lot of people move around from company to company, and a lot of times the work that's being done as it relates to packaging is on the shoulders of young engineers in their early 20s, and they end up going somewhere else. And then 5 years from now, someone's like, "Hey, this real-time study is due. Where the heck are these samples?" And you've got a whole other issue on your hands. So we do offer real-time aging storage at our lab. It's not, doesn't get us super excited, but it's important for those customers that really need that control over a long period of time. So that covers sort of the three main pillars and some of the testing work related to it. Before I get into the next section, Gene, any questions?
And we can ask the audience the same thing. Raise your hand if you have any questions. But Ryan, I think it's so interesting because I remember when I had my first exposure to medical device packaging years and years ago, and then over the years subsequent, you do get used to the terms and you get used to the things that have to be done, and you start to take them for granted that this has to be a part of my development planning. I think when we first encounter this, though, and I'm interested from our audience if they have this kind of a response, if you haven't encountered packaging before, you're so used to going into your kitchen and getting a Ziploc bag and stuffing something into it and being pretty sure that when you pull that seal on top and you stick it in your freezer, it's probably not going to leak all. I mean, it might, but it's probably not going to. And so then, I'm really tempted to think, oh, that's nice, Ryan. I guess you do these theoretical studies for some really, bleeding edge companies that for some reason that I don't know need to test their packaging. And I think what really struck me when I first encountered medical device packaging was, well, number one, you don't want to add tons and tons of weight. So these packagings have to be relatively light. They have to be porous to some of the gases that you use to sterilize the product, which means that they're actually relatively flimsy materials. And then I remember one of my first projects, we basically put the cartridges that we had into these Mylar Tyvek pouches. We folded them over, we stuck them into the box, and what do you know? They weren't rocket science, but where we folded them over the sharp edge of our cartridge, pretty much every single one, after you shook it a little bit, had sliced the packaging in half. And so I think it's sometimes hard for people to understand that with the requirements put around this, and also the testing requirements that FDA does have, you actually can't get away just saying, oh, just give me whatever's off the shelf. You're still going to have to do these tests. These are the average thing you do for a product that's claimed to be sterile. You're pretty much going to see all of these tests.
Absolutely. And couple of things I would just say in response, because you're absolutely right. One thing is that we often get questions like that. Where's this, isn't there stock packaging or standard packaging? And our customers are often really disappointed, and so are we, quite honestly, because it can be so nice a number of times to be able to just take something and use it and move the project forward. But it just really doesn't exist. There's not really a standard one size fits all. And I mean that in a more abstract way, of course. There's not like a one size fits all packaging system that you can take and just drop into. There have been a lot of efforts made at various manufacturers, especially contract manufacturers, to try to get a leg up on some of that qualification work to the extent that there is a way for some of that work to be shared across customers. But it's still fairly limited in nature, and there's still quite a bit of work that usually has to happen. And I've seen time and time again where somebody wants to cut corners, and it might help them, break the seal on getting the first unit shipped. But as soon as the next audit comes around, there's a big problem, and it can easily lead to recalls, if not 43s, and just make life really difficult and precarious, and especially put patients at risk. So yeah, it is important, but it is often work that most people aren't aware of, and they encounter it when they're embarking on a project, and then, it always happens at the worst time. They're wanting to get into market in 3 months, and, oh, I heard we got to do something with packaging. How do I fit that? And it's like, well, there's a lot more here. Now, my second thing, real quick, and Gene, I'll put you on the spot. If you had to guess, as a third-party lab, we're doing all this design validation work. What would be your guess on, out of 10 projects that come through the lab, how many of them might result in a defect that becomes presented after some of this?
Oh, I mean, how many times do I come up with the packaging? I'm going to come up with the packaging. I'm going to work with a packaging manufacturer. We're going to come up with it. We're going to send it to you, and you're going to put it through a standard battery of tests, and it's going to fail on my product.
Yes.
In some way, shape, or form, that means we've got to go back. That's going to be a very high percentage. That's over 50%. I'm going to guess.
You're spoken like a true veteran who's been through the ringer a few times. It is a high percentage. It's not that high. It's about 30%, which
it's 30%. Okay.
I was still surprised by when we went back and looked at the numbers. But if you think about that, that's 3 out of 10 studies that come through the lab that have some sort of defect that is going to present a risk to patient safety, which of course is a total showstopper and derails the whole effort. And usually by this time, if it's the very first time a product has ever gone for transit testing, and unfortunately that's the way a lot of the experiences go, and there's a failure, well, you're so entrenched by that point, to be able to pull back and reconfigure is really difficult. You've got other validation activity that's already ongoing. You've got validation activity that has already been executed, which may now be moot and have to be reperformed. You've got inventory on the shelf that might need to be thrown in the trash. You've got tools that likewise might just need to be thrown away. And then you've got the delay, which can be months long as you redesign and buy new tooling and get new first orders and then put them back through the sealing process and then get them built now. So it can be a big problem. So one of the other thing I would highlight, the first being the real-time aging. The second thing I would say is really the importance of doing some early stage feasibility testing, where even if it's just functional prototypes, and even if you just have one box, let's take it and let's do some down and dirty testing. Let's drop it from some extra high drops and put it on the table a little bit longer. Let's put it through a few different loops. There's ways that we can kind of trim the fat on how we might do a feasibility study, because we know sort of what hazards are a little bit more extreme. We can kind of compress that timeline a little bit. But let's do something to try to see if there are any surprises and jump in front of it now rather than later. And if we need to, let's do it again and do it again and do it again. Because by the time we get to validation, we really don't want to have any surprises. We want to have confident that things are going to pass. And that's usually a big pit that we see a lot of people fall into, is just being blindsided by all this work, and a lot of issues could be avoided if it was woven in a little bit earlier.
That right there is exactly it, and why we're so glad to have you here today, because so many of our startups are asking, I need to know what's coming. I need to know what's coming down the road. One of the reasons that they tune into shows like this is so it's like, okay, I want to learn all these little tidbits. What should I have in my hopper? What should I be thinking about? And this is one of those places where fail fast, fail early does apply. And then the question is when's the right time to do that? I don't want to miss, though, we've got our friend Ken Spencer with a question for you there, Ryan. Ken,
Sure.
You're live.
Yes. So Ryan, I know that Michigan State actually has a degree in packaging up
Yep,
there.
I'm a Michigan State grad myself.
Okay. So do
Go
they?
green for anybody out there?
Do they have?
We've got some on the call. Yes, we don't want to get that fight started right now, but many green and many maize and blue as well.
Yeah, sure.
So do they have a focus in this particular area at all in their packaging curriculum?
This is a great question. When I was at Michigan State, this was in the second half of the 2000s, 2005 to 2009. The Michigan State University School of Packaging was the largest school of packaging in the world, and it was something that the university as a whole took a lot of pride in. And a lot of other packaging engineers that I encounter out in the industry, usually 80% of the time, if not more, are fellow Michigan State grads. When I was there, we had a couple of classes that were specific to medical packaging. I wouldn't say it was a core focus by any means. I don't know what the landscape is today, but the professor that is responsible for the medical world, her name is Dr. Laura Bix. She's a really amazing person, and has done just a tremendous amount of research to advance the field of study in the medical space. I think much of which I think she's a little before her time. I think a lot of her work will blossom in the years to come, especially, it's kind of a good segue. One of her main focuses is usability and human factors. I in no way am representing Dr. Bix's work here. This is totally independent and in many ways very different, but just to give kudos to Michigan State School of Packaging and some of the good work that's being done there, and some of the ways in which it's becoming very relevant.
Yeah, and a follow-up for PCL themselves, I mean, do you have a nationwide reach? I mean, how many labs are there that are like yours out there?
That's a really good question. There's a number of labs around the country that have some overlap in terms of some of the things that we might share in common. For example, there's a lot of different labs you can go to have transit testing performed. But those same labs might not also have accelerated aging, and they might not also have sterile barrier integrity testing. Or if they happen to have a suite of services that encompass those things. They might be just born from sort of years of being in the industry and slowly adding things on. I think what's unique about our lab is that we started the company with the primary mission to be in the life sciences space, and our team and currently still the staff that is both leading the company and participating in important ways are trained in either medical packaging or some sort of life sciences related discipline, or have spent time in the medical device manufacturing industry. And we really bring all of that together to help inform how do we put together a portfolio of services that's really geared for our medical customers. And then when we can layer in the engineers on top of that, who can actually go out and be on site in a clean room for a few days, helping to troubleshoot a machine and know how to document that study in the right way, or even how to set it up the right way, and to be able to provide those testing services and turn that back around, all under one roof as kind of a turnkey type of experience. That's kind of a unique assembly of these common building blocks that certainly somebody out there could reassemble themselves, but we haven't seen anybody do that in quite the same way just yet. But we're looking 3 steps ahead, and we've got some tricks up our sleeve to stay ahead of the curve.
Very good. Thank you for that question, Ken. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left to cover this. I want to make sure we hit usability and human factors, because people have heard about this. They've heard us talk about things like benefit risk. They've heard us talk about usability and how FDA wants to see that. The medical device industry in general is trying to harmonize all these things. So take us for a minute here, Ryan, into usability and how this affects packaging.
Sure. So let's kind of dive in. And I know we've got 5 minutes, so I'll kind of go through it quickly here. As I mentioned earlier, there was a new version of 11607 that came out in 2019. And that's where we saw the idea of usability being inserted for the first time. I've got just a screenshot on the page here of it's a longer section. This is just a few clauses from the first part of it, just to kind of orient you to what the flavor of the language is like. But basically, the idea is we want to take the same frustrations that we might experience, or I should say acknowledge that the same frustrations we experience in consumer products or food and beverage, like everyone's frustrated getting into clamshells or has trouble opening bags of food, and how frustrating that is. We certainly don't want that type of experience for nurses and clinical staff in an operating room when you're being worked on. They need to be able to access that part and dispense it safely and not contaminate it along the way or drop it or whatever. So that's really why this has been introduced. Now, Jane, you had asked me to kind of touch on like zoom out of the idea of human factors a little bit and kind of connect the dots to the industry at large. Admittedly, since this is a very new topic for us, I'm still very much learning. But we have done some research into ANSI HE75 and FDA Guidance 1757 to help just get an idea of how we might model something like this. Those standards are very rigorous and very prescriptive because they're designed for human factors studies on actual devices. And there's no expectation in the language of the new version of 11607 that we approach this type of work to quite the same rigor. So we're really just trying to kind of drop into a similar type of framework, but kind of make it relevant and appropriate for the nature of work that we might do for packaging. And that said, since it's brand new, there's not an ASTM standard, there's no other place we can really look. And we felt like it was just a natural problem because we're not the only ones struggling with how to address this. Just as a thought leader in the industry and in keeping with our mission, we just felt it was important for us to try to spearhead putting something out there and trying to develop a solution. And so in the next few slides, actually, what I'm going to do is talk about a case study that we did recently. Rather than kind of pick apart how this might be modeled, I'm going to talk you through how we did it as an example. And I've given a talk like this a couple of times, and there were usually really good questions from the audience about like, what does the standard say about sample size and this or that? I'm still learning as well. I just want to show you sort of what we did and kind of what we took took away from it, and I'll answer those type of particulars to the best that I can. So the program that we've set up here, really, the intent is to have a turnkey way to meet this requirement, modeled after those related standards that I mentioned, and really with the intent to assess things like the design, aseptic presentation, and things related to how users might interact with it in a clinical setting, and the types of frustrations and expectations that they would have for what they would consider a good experience. And so the case study that I'll talk about is a project we did in which the customer had a product that was still in the research and development phase. So they were kind of excited to just collaborate with us on a pilot study, since they had every intention that there were going to be some further changes and testing downstream. But they were at a good part in the study where they wanted to get at least some feedback from a human factors standpoint and sort of go through the motions and see what came out of it. So it was a really good relationship for a pilot study. So they had a single-use device here. It was an ophthalmic device used in eye surgery. And they had some functional prototypes, and they had some packaging materials, and they sent some of those items up to us and said, hey, can you help us support this human factors study? So what we did as we endeavored on the project was we started by going through a lot of due diligence really on user credentialing. So if we're going to have a usability study, one of the expectations is that we actually have real clinical users come out and do the evaluation, and not just engineers thinking we know what users want. We want real users to come out and provide feedback. So we hired a clinical consultant that had a core specialty in this type of casework, and she helped us understand what type of credentials would be important if we were going to solicit feedback and have people participate, and informed us a lot about some other things we'll go into in the next couple of slides. And we ended up having a total of 6 users, including circulating and perioperative nurses, as well as surgical technicians. And just a few pictures on the bottom, what I'm showing here is sort of the mock setting that we set up, intending to simulate an operating room. Because it was an eye surgery, usually in the surgical environment, the lights are dimmed, which is why the lights are turned off right here. And that is a good segue into another important variable in the process, which is really putting together a representative environment in which to conduct this type of simulation. So we look at things like how many people are typically in the room, what other stuff, like what other related surgical instruments or products, whatever, are going to be occupying the space and contributing to clutter, how many tables and stands, and just how does the whole room get set up. And when we did the actual, like on the day of and did the assessment, we made sure that each of the people coming in to do that had an opportunity to give us feedback and confirm that the site was otherwise representative enough for there to be nothing that would otherwise impair their ability to assess the situation. And then to conduct the study, we treated it as, and some of this is actually derived from those standards, like words like this word formative study is one of those words that comes from this other standard. There's a couple of different ways to structure a human factor study. There's formative study designs. There are heuristic study designs, a couple other big words that I'm still trying to wrap my head around as well. But this study in particular, we went the formative route, which entailed what we call a cognitive walkthrough, where a moderator was present and sort of helping the clinician navigate the experience, and making sure along the way to ask the questions we needed to ask to get the feedback we needed, but without asking leading questions that could make that feedback not quite as accurate. And there's more I could say about that whole part of the process, but we did consider those types of things. And when the project was done, what we did is compiled a variety of photographs. We had also conducted audio recording throughout the couple hours that it was going on, so we could review back and make sure we didn't miss any details, and select parts of that were put into a transcript. And then we ultimately weighed all of that feedback against a pre-established set of criteria had a report issued, and then that information was able to re-inform some of the decisions the customer needed to make about potential design changes. And they also had some ammunition then to plug into things like their FMEAs and other related design and development documentation that was really helpful. So some things that we learned was that the actual people participating were a little bit concerned that they were going to give feedback that was somehow wrong and that they might be liable for bad decisions. So in the future, we're going to make sure that that's front and center, that maybe not even tell them fully about the, how the information is being used, so that they're not feeling that type of pressure. Of course, we alleviated that and explained kind of how it all works. And then it was very important to make sure we considered, as I mentioned, the environment and having that representative, but also, things like the other products that might be cluttering the space, competing for real estate on the tables or for attention, and keeping people gowned appropriately, wearing gloves if they're supposed to wear gloves, who's handing out to who, is it a one-person job, a two-person job, and what are the roles and responsibilities. Having a clear expectation for the requirements. How are we going to take this feedback and say, green light, red light with it, and then also understanding like what to do with it if the feedback isn't great. If what do we do with that? Does that mean we need to redesign something, or does it just become information that we have in file? And if we go back and redo it, what is the scope and scale of that? So there are some things that we still are working through, but we've got a really exciting space that's set up here that we'll put more publicly out there sometime soon, probably on our website or in a blog article on the site. We've actually we're just wrapping up an expansion of our facility, and part of that expansion included building out a mock operating theater so that we can have a proper space to do this type of thing. So now when you come in, we've got a mock operating room and all the parts and pieces in there. It's pretty cool. But it'll be a lot of fun. This is the start of a journey that's going to become very natural in the future, but it's still a little bit fuzzy at the moment. And we're happy to talk about this today because we know we're not the only ones that are being confronted with navigating this. And to the extent this helps, people sort of make sense of things, great. And we're going to keep learning and hopefully this year sort of solidify what we think is a good plan of attack. And I actually just learned within the last couple of weeks that there is going to be an ASTM working group that's kicked off to develop a proper ASTM standard around how to address this. So hopefully there's some more information to share on that front in the not too distant future. But yeah, that's what I got. So question?
That's great, Ryan. A little bit of a selfish question, and the audience, if I know we're past the top of the hour, so some people have had to drop off, but feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Ryan, a little bit of a selfish question here. Do you intend for your usability evaluations that you're clearly doing for the purposes of packaging, you're building out a theater and things like that, do you intend to be able to host larger usability evaluations that a client might need to do for more of their product, not just the packaging?
That's a really great question, and we're seeing this as an opportunity to sort of investigate that further. And it is something that has come up at some of our recent leadership meetings as we talk about, what our plan is for the next couple of years. And we do have kind of a pathway carved out that allows us to actually expand this into its own sort of its own facility, but we don't really know how big that needs to be. Probably not very big, but bigger than what we have, just tucked away in our current setting. We don't know. So we're going to see what the market comes back with, what type of response we get, what the needs are, and we're prepared and budgeted to make some investments and make some moves where we need to. But our mission is to help get products onto market as quickly and safely and effectively as possible. This is an area where we can make a difference, and we're committed. Appreciate the chance to share about it today.
Well, this has been just great. Not seeing any more questions, I just want to say, Ryan, I really appreciate you being here today. I remember some number of years ago, there was a particular capability that we needed at Into Being. It was a clinical pathology need that the expertise, the only place in the country we could find it was West Virginia. And so one of our staff made the drive down there with the parts and with the things on many occasions over the course of weeks to get this part of the process done. So I think it's so important for people to recognize that there are companies here in the state of Michigan doing maybe not clinical pathology in this case, but in this case, some really critical things that just get overlooked, like we talked about earlier. But this is a fail early, fail fast area for medical device development. And we just think it's really cool that you're there. We do have one more quick question here from our friend Ken Spencer.
Yeah, can you hear me?
If he's with us, Ken. Yep. Yeah, we can hear you. You're great.
Okay. So first of all, Gene, I hope you're feeling okay. And all right, good.
Thanks. I'm doing great, Ken. I appreciate it.
Okay. And I don't know if you saw the COVID task force presentation today, but to some of your earlier questions, they are in fact allowing Pfizer to call their vials 6 doses. So they are in fact measuring that. And they also called out 9 states who have 10% vaccination rates that are out there. And to your point earlier, it's kind of the states that have lower populations. And, you know, in Michigan, like the UP looks good, things like that. And one of the things that hurts us statistically is that in the southern part of the state, we have huge hospital systems there. And those, the clinicians there, rightfully so, are prioritized out there, right? And they're trying to hold off on the second vaccinations and things like that. So the fact that as an overall state, we're at 9% is pretty darn good.
Very cool. No, thanks for that, Ken. We appreciate that. Good news and good data. Yeah, and it's so funny because you don't get to conduct, like we've been talking about here, you don't get to conduct a usability study ahead of time when you're trying to do a national vaccine rollout. So everyone's having to sort of figure this out on the fly. But again, I think we heard that the syringes involved in the dosing of the Pfizer vaccine, there's actually a particular type of syringe which most people don't have lying around, which is how you have to get that 6th dose out if you want it out of the vial. So kind of crazy stuff, but it goes right to what we're talking about today. You got to think about these things. If you're trying to make a device that's going to sit on a shelf and just work, you have to think about those kinds of things. That goes into usability of packaging. So I think it's a very apropos example. And with that, since we're past the top of the hour, I want to thank Ryan Erickson for being with me today here on MedTech Crossroads. Next week at the end of the show is going to be our first pitch for the pitch party. We are glad you're here with us today. I want to thank you for joining us on MedTech Crossroads and thank Ryan Erickson for being with us today. Thanks again, Ryan.
I appreciate it.
Have a great day, everybody.